Okay, we'll get underway, everybody. Very good. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Notre Dame at our Broadway campus. My name is David De Carvalho. I'm the relatively recently arrived new Executive Dean of the Faculty of Education, Philosophy and Theology. Getting a bit of feedback over there. Okay. Not sure what we can do about that. We'll fix that in a sec. So welcome to the second of our special lectures. Tom Bennett has come to Australia all the way from Scotland. This is the second of his 3 lectures on the state of education. The first one he gave last last Wednesday in Fremantle, at our Fremantle campus, entitled The Dark Ages. How is it that we've lost our way in terms of the management of classroom behaviour? The second one tonight is the Enlightenment. What have we learned about classroom behaviour in the meantime? And next week, on Thursday, we will have the third and final lecture in Melbourne on the Renaissance. How can we go forward to the future? So a little bit about, before I go to Tom, just like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, because they have been, are and will continue to be true educators, passing on the knowledge and wisdom of their cultures through thousands of generations. A little bit about Tom. He was a teacher in the East End of London for 13 years. In 2009, he was made a Teacher Fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge University. From 2008 to 2016, he wrote a weekly column for the Times Education Supplement and is the author of 5 books on teacher training, behaviour management and educational research, including Running the Room, A Teacher's Guide to Behaviour Management. In 2015, he was long-listed for the GEMS Global Teacher Prize, and in the same year named as one of the Huffington Post's top 10 global educational bloggers. Most importantly, I think for many who know him through ResearchEd, in 2013, he founded ResearchEd, a grassroots teacher-led project that aims to make teachers research literate and pseudoscience proof. Since then, it has grown into an international community spanning 6 continents, annually holding events in 13 countries. In 2015, Tom was appointed as School Behaviour Advisor to the Department of Education by the Secretary of State for Education. In March 2017, Tom wrote Creating a Culture, an Independent Review of Behaviour in Leadership of UK Schools. Tom coaches teachers and schools around the world in all aspects of behaviour management and research integration, and regularly appears in national and international press and media. And in 2022, he was awarded an OBE in the Queen's New Year's Honours List in recognition of his work in education, particularly improving behaviour and advancing the use of evidence in teaching. So without further ado, Tom, we welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming out. I'm glad that echo stopped. Thank you, Virginia. I'm very grateful to you. And hello to everyone at home in television land who are listening from afar. Thanks very much for giving up some of your time to come and attend this. I never take it for granted. Can you put your hand up? Did anyone here watch the first lecture? God bless you. Look at that. Some stalwarts there. Yeah. People work at the university. That's fine. I mean, where were you? I'm not offended in the slightest. It's largely, as David was saying there, it's kind of a triptych of lectures designed for, almost as a personal reflection from me as to where I think we went wrong, particularly in the UK when it came to behaviour, but then relating that more broadly to the international sphere. And I've loosely arranged it around some major historical and intellectual ideological revolutions, the so-called, of course, Dark Ages, the Enlightenment, and so on. So the Renaissance. So last lecture, I kind of outlined where I think we'd gone wrong, what things were like. And I'm talking about near recent history here. I'm not talking about a long time ago. I'd also like to offer some reflections of what I think we've started to get right. Now, I'm offering the UK experience here, not as an exemplar of perfect practice by any means. We have made many, many mistakes. The UK is in some ways a basket case when it comes to our domestic and international politics. And I make no bones about that. But I think educationally, ironically, we've done a lot of things right for reasons I'm going to explain why. And we have seen some in practice success, thankfully. So hopefully this isn't so much moonshine. Let me just, excuse me. There's lots of people with their hands raised online. I hope the web mistress over there can sort that out. So I'm going to start off with the Enlightenment. Now, this isn't a lecture on the actual Enlightenment, but I think it's worth, I mean, if you wish, I'm more than happy to detour. It's a favourite topic of mine. One of my favourite philosophers of the Enlightenment was David Hume, who was a fellow countryman and one of my absolute favourite people to teach. So Enlightenment, of course, was a period of great innovation and revolution in the intellectual history of humanity and certainly European civilization. Started with the publication of Newton's Principia Mathematica, and broadly speaking, ended with the French Revolution. Of course, there is some dispute as to what that should actually involve, but that's a broad overview. I think it's encapsulated by Immanuel Kant's favourite saying, "Sapere aude, dare to know, dare to know." It was, of course, famously characterized as a rejection of the ideological and intellectual structures which dominated culture up to that point. It was a rejection of the authority of monarchs. Broadly speaking, there was, to some extent, an anti-religious, or not anti-religious, but a rejection of faith as the basis of a rational thought. It was an emphasis on reason and the scientific method. And it was facilitated and disseminated through things like coffee houses, pamphlets, and so on, salons, journals. I'm going to draw some fairly stark and fairly blunt on-the-nose parallels between that and what we went through ourselves. Now, in the Dark Ages, I hope you're enjoying my choice of imageries for the Dark Ages here. Now, the Dark Ages, of course, is a much contested term, but broadly speaking, in terms of education, the way things were, and I'm talking about near recent history here, I'm not talking about a long, long time ago. I'm talking about kind of from the 70s onwards, particularly in UK education. And I see a lot of parallels internationally as well. You've got a sense that the teacher training that we enjoyed or endured barely talked or touched upon behaviour management. And it was an absolutely, it was an arcane topic. As I said last week, I got a half-an-hour behaviour lecture and it was useless. It gave me no understanding whatsoever because at the time, what I was being asked to understand and interpret was too complex. I was going to the classroom where you are inundated, deluged with experience, with no ability to categorize or understand it or comprehend it. It's like, and I think my analogy was, it's like going to Covent Garden Opera House to watch a revival of Swan Lake and being asked to in some way dissect and understand what the prima ballerina was doing. You know, it's impossible for a novice to understand what an expert is doing when there's so much data coming at one time. And behaviour management is very like that. You're supposed to observe people and copy them and see and emulate in some shape or form. This was not an ideal form. We often found that the leadership of training of behaviour management was also just as bad, if not worse. That leaders typically would have had no access or experience of any kind of training in the institutional construction of behavioural norms, routines, processes, consequences, or anything along those lines. We found that in behaviour, in particular, many myths, half-myths, quasi-myths abounded, that what passed for behaviour management was frequently guesswork. It was frequently things that we had invented, things we'd inherited. I often call this folk teaching. It was a sense of, you know, well, everyone's been doing this for a while, so perhaps I should too. In exactly the same way that folk medicine can be understood. I mean, folk medicine isn't without efficacy. There are plenty of folk remedies which have been proven to have lots and lots of powers that we've then invented and investigated and understood. But the problem with folk medicine is, of course, it's not as thoroughly tested or necessarily as well-founded as we would sometimes hope. And that's why we use the empirical method to try to find out what works and what doesn't work, and indeed when it works and when it doesn't work. There was lots of things that I was taught about and told about when I was, sorry, latecomers have to stand at the front. Sorry, that's the rule. Just like any classroom. Zogi, you didn't miss anything. I was just killing time. So there was lots of things that I was broadly taught. When I asked for help, I was told that that I should focus on relationships, but I wasn't told how to build relationships. So therefore the advice was worse than useless. It's not wrong. Behavior management is very about relationships, but it's a bit like telling a comedian to be funny. I was told also that, that behavior would be amenable to specific interventions, like one-off moments and so on. And there was no emphasis whatsoever on culture and creating an environment where good behavior was more likely and bad behavior was less likely. Ad hoc responses. There was a very low understanding of systems. I went to lots and lots of schools, and from a leadership perspective, you would find lots of school teachers were just kind of responding to misbehavior as they found it. And it was a very ad hoc reactive process. And there was lots of very dominant ideologies. So a lot of people would say, particularly in those days, that if children were misbehaving, it was because of some kind of deep-seated form of trauma. Although the word trauma actually hadn't come into usage by by that point. That was a more contemporary thing. Or that relationships could be that misbehavior could be understood pathologically. Could be understood as some kind of pathology of behavior and circumstance. So there was lots of that swimming around, lots of very weak advice. And the reason why we were in that state or had been left in that state is because professional training was utterly inadequate. The teacher training barely talked about behaviour management, and frequently it was done by people who couldn't manage a classroom. Now, I'm going to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that is suboptimal. That there are better ways of teaching something, and if I want someone to show me the way to go somewhere, I'd like to ask somebody who knows where to go. And that may sound a shocking revelation, but I think what was more shocking was that it was the situation we endured. There was a very low capacity within the system to enact change and improvements. The schools were very, very busy and didn't have much time to do anything about it, and very little desire at the systems level, at the political level, very little political will to do anything about behaviour, which leads me into national leadership. Very frequently, people who talked about behaviour management and how to manage behaviour in schools, when they did, which was inoften, if that's a word, you would find that they would be what I call domain elites rather than domain experts. They were people who were in charge, but they weren't necessarily experts in what they were talking about. And this frequently happens at a political level when it comes to managing all aspects of not just behaviour, but also teacher training. There was also an inadequate definition of expertise. What did it mean to be good at behaviour management? Frequently, people in schools who were called good at behaviour management were simply people who had been there for a long time, or they were high status. Sometimes people who were called good at behaviour management were people who didn't expect their children to do very much. It's very easy to get children to behave if you never ask them to do anything they don't want to do. The trick is to get them to behave in a way which helps them to flourish and blossom as human beings, as well as learners, but also in a way which challenges them and pushes them beyond their own comfort zones and safety barriers. I found that classroom practitioners were atomized. I should explain what that means. They weren't literally atomized. That is, and currently is, illegal in the United Kingdom, and I assume Australia. What it means is that the relationships were atomized, that it was very hard to disseminate and share best practice beyond your classroom, your staff room, the broom cupboard in which you resided. There were very few ways in which a mere teacher, who to some extent is often the possessor of the expertise when it comes to behaviour, could share that beyond their immediate training and staff relationships, which meant that there were bubbles in silos of expertise which frequently did not speak to one another. I call these hyper-local communities. I also found that another one of the inhibiting factors when it comes to behaviour management was the ideology which infected on being helped. Staged invaded. Is this a protest? No. I also support your cause. I understand this happens a lot. Sorry. I'm sorry, I think I was supposed to just pretend that was invisible. My apologies, sorry. It never happened. We'll just cut that from the floods. So the system in which we inhabited was very ideologically driven. What might broadly be called educational progressivism was the dominant model, which is to say the idea that children are perfect. The children are naturally perfect and that society corrupts them and we need only stand aside. Children will blossom and flourish and bloom like a million butterflies before us. Behaviourally speaking, this is not the case. The idea that children will behave if we simply let them do as they wish to do. Have you ever met a child? I have. I've met many, many, many. I've been to 1,000. I keep saying this now, but it's become my mantra. I've been to 1,000 schools. I've just added them up. Just over 1,000 schools. I've never met the perfect child. I've met beautiful, wonderful children. What I have not met is a perfect child who behaves simply because we ask them to nicely. And a lot of the CPD, sorry, I should maybe say PD, professional development, we would say continuous professional development, was based on the point of demand. There's a lot of training that was going on in schools, which was of very low quality, with no filters whatsoever. And it was simply bought at the point of contact and budgeted and paid for and allocated. But the idea was that we would trust the people who were paying the budgets on the understanding that they themselves possessed some level of professional expertise. And why wouldn't we, given that they were running schools? I'm sure all of the PD you have sat and endured has been perfect. I've endured a good deal of very, very low quality PD where enthusiastic, well-meaning Muppets would clap their hands and invite us to do star jumps and tell us how awesome we were. And then they had to do the same with children and all would be well. I'm caricaturing for comic effect, but you get the idea. There's also a very low public awareness. Most people didn't know this was happening in classrooms. Most parents would be astonished to know that 20 years ago, at least in the UK, you would not be taught how to teach in a teacher training course. It sounds a bit odd to say that, but you would not. You would not be taught how to manage a classroom. You would be taught, as I was, how to make up a PowerPoint slide. You would be taught, as I was, how to make a poster. You would be taught, as I was, how to give compliments to people. It was the strangest experience ever, and I went to one of the highest rated universities in Europe for teacher training. Low political awareness, ministers didn't know or care. Local authorities, I don't know what you would call that here, but the local government which governs education, what would be the devolved state of that here? You can answer me if you want. Yeah, okay, thank you. So apologies. I'm not sorry, interaction will come later. I do apologize. The box will be thrown soon. We have an inspector, which we call Ofsted, and it actually actively penalised school, along with local authorities, for having high rates of suspension and exclusion. May I just say, high rates of suspension and exclusion are not to be welcomed or delighted or embraced. It's not a cause for celebration. Some schools will have to do it more than others, but some schools have to do it. And schools would be actively penalised for doing so, which meant, of course, that they did not, even when they should, which meant that persistent misbehaviour was rewarded with, well, being kept in the classroom, be kept in the same school over and over again. There was a famous review by a man called Alan Steer who said that 85% of schools were good or better. And there was nothing to see here. That's the state of play. That is a brief summary and development of what I said in the last session. No, you didn't have to have attended it. You're more than welcome. That was my recap. So what happened to change things? Well, my favourite tarot card, the Tower. Don't you have a favourite tarot card? And I love the quote from Leonard Cohen, there's a crack in everything, that's where the light shines in. Things changed, but we have to understand how things changed. Round about 2010, it's coincidentally was when I first joined Twitter. He says, flattering himself to some extent. I was a part of this, but I was a part of a much greater construct. Social media was definitely one of the spokes in the wheel of this rather tired and dominant system. It short-circuited what I sometimes call the priesthood of this system, because it finally allowed teacher to speak unto teacher, practitioner unto practitioner. And it meant that your voice could travel much further than the staff room. You could travel to other teachers, to other schools. In fact, around the world, words shall fly in the twinkling of an eye, as the prophecy goes, and they did. And you could tweet one thing or put something on Facebook if you're over 50. And somebody would read it in Australia or Canada, and you could contest and challenge and speak and talk. And at last, there seemed to be some form of professional voice, which had lacked before. And it seems almost archaic to say that this would be the first time this had happened, but it really had, given that. And this is no discredit to them, but for instance, in the UK, the unions would very much represent what the union leaders wanted to represent. And again, I'm not knocking that. That's the model. That's how they operate. But any idea that they would be a kind of a representative voice of the broad or the broader sphere or nuance of things being discussed is obviously not the case. And some unions are better at it than others. Unions are very, very necessary entities, but they often speak with one voice when they represent multiple voices. And I think that's to be acknowledged. So teacher voice happened. There was political will in the UK. I'll talk about that in a second. But we had a number of ministers who became very animated by education, who understood actually broadly the broad sweep of education. They weren't simply ministers who'd come in from health or transport and dropped in and asked to suddenly reinvent the wheel. These were people who had studied with and worked with people in the education sector for some period of time. And political will meant a lot. So we had two things happening. We had people on the ground and we had people above. And that made a unique pincer movement, which I think which gave us a particular intensity of speed of revolution and transformation. Things started to change quite quickly. There was a process in schools called academisation, which broadly meant that schools were taken out of local authority or local government control, and they were still funded by the government, but they were allowed to be run by academies or academy trusts. I mean, there are similar entities in many, many countries. I'm sure you enjoy or endure some of them yourself. There are many arguments for and against such a system, but the main argument for such a system is the plurality of the system, the introduction of new ideas. It's not quite a marketplace of ideas, but enabled schools to have greater freedom and autonomy over what it was that they did. Many inventions, many experiments occurred, some good and some bad. Many flourished, many fell by the roadside. A free school movement, which I think is similar to the charter school movement in that respect, both in Sweden and in America. And that was much more about starting new schools. Academies became a lot more about converting existing schools. And that multi-academy trusts started to evolve and emerge. And these were combinations of schools which formed families, clusters, and networks of schools, but very, very closely aligned, financially aligned, strategically aligned, institutionally aligned, and often ideologically aligned. And so replacing the LA became the multi-academy trust, the MAT model. LA schools still exist. About 52% of schools in the United Kingdom are academies, and over 48% or slightly less because there are some other forms, about 42% or something are local authority schools. So what that means is that we now have a mixture of schools, but the majority of children, the vast majority of children are in academies. 52% of schools, but something like, I forget the exact figure, but it's like 65% of children are in academy trusts. So we're starting to see a lot of innovation. But there were other things going on, because innovation by itself without any new ideas or practices or structures is pointless. I mean, you may as well just rearrange the deck chairs in the Titanic. So what happened was this: there was a lot of teacher voices who started to emerge, who were credible, who were realistic, who were evidence-informed, who really started to look at their evidence bases and query what it was that they were doing. And rather than simply relying on their intuition, their gut instinct, or what they'd inherited from their predecessors, they started to look at any evidence bases that were available to try and understand what it was that we were doing, or doing right, or doing wrong. I mean, there were scores and scores and scores of these people. I mean, some of my favorites in the old days. Do you remember blogging? Blogging, I don't know if blogging is such a thing anymore. It's kind of died off. Long tweets, perhaps. Substack, but nobody can read them, that kind of thing. But blogging was a real phenomenon in the UK. It was absolutely intense. Everybody had a blog at one point in the UK. Andrew Old was one of my favorites. He's an absolutely ruthless, merciless man, mathematician by trade, incredibly logical, absolutely relentless, and picks apart bogus claims like a buzzard picking apart a corpse. That's not a great metaphor. I might use a different one next time. Joe Kirby was another one. He worked at a famous school called Michaela Community School, which is a dream to some and a nightmare to others. And he was an extremely efficient teacher and a very, very, very articulate, intelligent voice. And David Dyer and many, many people were writing these blogs. And there was a real sense of experiment. There's a real sense of almost iconoclasm about the era. This idea that, let's see what works. What do we actually know about pedagogy, assessment, curriculum, or any aspect of school practice? And then, of course, there'd be more famous books like E.D. Hirsch's Cultural Literacy, which really became a touchstone in many of the movements. This idea that if you want to be known as literate or credibly literate, you had to have an extremely strong and effective knowledge base, that knowledge was at the basis of skills, and the domains thereby could be obtained by domain-specific expertise. I know there's still some big debates about that. The knowledge skill debates rages on, of course, in many people's hearts. But E.D. Hirsch was a huge advocate of the idea of knowledge as being the basis of all these things. Daniel Willingham, of course, Professor Daniel Willingham from the University of Virginia, and a wonderful human being, as I say, and also an extremely articulate interpreter of psychological data sets for teacher practitioners. He's one of these people that can speak classroom and speak academic, if that makes sense. He's multilingual in that respect. One of the best books I've ever read for teachers is Why Don't Students Like School? I recommend it to anybody who works in a school environment as a very good primer for the basics of psychology for anybody who works with children. Daisy Christodoulou, a good friend of mine, she wrote a book called 7 Myths, where she undertook a forensic examination and dissection of some of the more progressive ideologies that dominated at the time. And even people like Doug Lemov. Everyone knows Doug Lemov, Teach Like a Champion, the doyen of uncommon schools. His work in the behavioural field was one of the inspirations for me. It's certainly one of the first people I read who I thought, that's credible. I recognise what he's saying about classrooms there. He understands what classrooms feel like because he's done it himself. And best of all, he watched other people who did it. These books started to be quite pivotal in transforming what people believed about what was possible in terms of behaviour, assessment, curriculum, pedagogy, and so on. One thing beget another. New schools started to rise. And academisation genuinely provoked and produced innovation on a broad scale and very, very quickly as well. And I'll talk about that in a second. Because education had been removed from local authority control, well, this was an experiment. And in some ways, there were lots of risks to be done thereby, because, of course, local education authorities have got economies of scale, they've got resources, they've got systems, they've got people in place. But sadly, in my experience and the experience of many other people, many local authorities had what you might call very low standards when it came to supporting schools, that the people, they had jobs, perhaps because they were career bureaucrats, or perhaps because they said things that other people agreed with. And there's a real kind of a real sense of a Kafkaesque nightmare about many of the LAs and the ways that they supported schools. Perhaps that's a bit too strong, but that was certainly my experience. That when the LAs came to support you, you always had to take the advice with a pinch of salt. I don't know if this is true or not. And quite frequently, they were staffed by people who were escapees from the school environment, who themselves couldn't hack working in challenging schools. Again, that may be a little bit harsh, but there we go. This is my autoethnography. New schools opened. Now, the most famously, and I'm very happy to take questions on this if you like, Michaela Community School, which is so famous. I mean, I am literally on the other side of the world to where I normally stomp. And people talk to me all the time about the Michaela Community School. I mean, you got to hand it to them. What a lighthouse that is in many ways. I've been there about a dozen times. I know the head teacher, Catherine Birbelsing, very well. I'm very proud to know her and call her a friend. I think what she's done there is absolutely astonishing. Now, it's not everyone's cup of tea, nor should it be, but I invite anyone who wants to, and if you can, please hop on the next ferry over and go and see it. She is delighted to have guests. She has guests on a daily basis. It's an organised tour every single day. But it's not a guide. Well, it is a semi-guided tour. You're taken around by a child, but you're allowed to go to any classroom and speak to any student you wish. There is no animatronics in Catherine's school. And it literally gets the best results in the whole of the UK. It has an extremely challenging demographic. It is above average special educational needs and above average poverty, but way above average in terms of poverty. There's no fraud or fakery involved in this. Now, many people don't like the way it runs things. And again, that's certainly something we can discuss. But what can't be denied is the children are happy there. And I know the reason I say that is because I ask them every time I go, do you like it here? And they smile with enthusiasm. And it's not the forced rictus grin of somebody who's been pushed forward and told that their family is at risk if they don't agree. And I say, why do you like it here? And they say, because we're safe here. We learn loads. I spoke to a year 7 pupil in Michaela. I said, what are you studying? She said, Julius Caesar, the play, not just him. And I said, that's quite an advanced text for a year 7 student. That's wow, blimey. And so what's it about? She says, oh, it's about the downfall of a tyrant. So that's a pretty good answer. But you know what? I thought to myself, yeah, but this is just rote learning. This is just mimicking. This is just memorization. I'm talking to a parrot here. So somebody who's been drilled. I said, okay, what's a tyrant? And she went, it's a ruler who rules undemocratically. It's not a perfect answer, but it's not bad. And I said, do you know any lines from it? And she recited an entire screed of it. You know, so there was memorization for sure, but there was understanding. You know, there was comprehension. Certainly way above what you'd expect. And I thought, oh, maybe that's just the cleverest kid in the school. I asked child after child, and I asked children with special needs. I asked children with ADHD. I asked children with mild forms of autism. I asked children with behavioural disorders. And they all loved it. And they all demonstrated above average levels of success. I'm not resting this entire case on one school, but it is interesting to see what happens when you innovate. This is literally the highest achieving school in the whole of the UK. Children there on average achieve more than 2 grades higher, 2, which is unheard of, than their contemporaries in similar circumstances. It's leagues ahead of the next best school. Other schools abounded, the Dixon's chain, Bedford Free School. This was not uncommon. There was lots and lots of schools that were doing things perhaps similar to Michaela, but often very different. And may I just say, in my experience, that schools can be wonderful in thousands of different ways. There is no one ideal school. Michaela isn't an ideal school. They are the perfect version of themselves. They are perfectly evolved, like a shark, perhaps. But they are a wonderful version of what they want to be. There are other ways to be, other styles, other fashions, other personalities. Brilliant schools can look very, very different from one another. And that fills me with joy and hope. As I say, I've seen 1,000 schools in 16 different countries. They can all be very different, and that's wonderful. I embrace plurality, but chaotic schools always look the same. And that's something I've always noticed. They also smell the same, lots of different environments. Flatulence. And we started to see very different behavioural approaches in schools. Now, by very different behavioural approaches, I'm not talking about anything particularly iconoclastic or particularly radical. You know, we weren't talking about brand new ways of inflicting suffering. We weren't talking about, brand new ways of inflicting fear or dominance. This is very much about things that many people would have recognised from parenting, perhaps. And it was more, perhaps I'm jumping the gun slightly here, but it was boundaries, high expectations, but also clearly patiently taught behavioural curriculums. Also a clear sense of supporting children in an individual targeted way. None of this is controversial. I mean, this is how people have raised kids for thousands of years. But what I think we often saw in the dark ages of this project was a resistance to perhaps some of those processes. That what you would find is that schools would be dominated by more therapeutic processes, or processes which didn't make sense to teachers at the time. I was frequently told just to say a few kind words to children and then take them back in my classroom and simply endure the behaviour over and over again. This is no behaviour system. This is an abdication of a system. And what we started to see in places like Dixon's and Bedford and Charles Dickens Primary School and the ARC Academies and so on, we started to see the institution of behavioural norms as a norm, as something that should be taught and expected and sustained and supported, and not just punished. Punishments have got no place in school. You shouldn't punish any children. Punishments are about revenge. Punishments are about getting your own back. Punishments are a quid pro quo. Punishments are an eye for an eye. That's not why we administer any kind of penalties for a child. We administer sanctions, and sanctions are deterrents. The sanctions are not the whole of your behaviour policy. And I'm jumping the gun slightly here. And not next week, don't worry, David, I'll be here. Next lecture, I'll talk more about the things that really do seem to have high levels of impact. But I will mention this. These schools characterise a taught behavioural approach. They frequently had very low levels of penalty or sanction. Why? Because they taught the behaviour so well. The behaviour expectations were upheld and taught, and children understood them, therefore embraced them more. But I'll come back to it later on. It is noticeable that many of these schools, when they transformed or were created, like the free schools, experienced enormous amounts of pushback. Before Michaela Community School could be opened, I think it chose 3 different sites. And on 2 of the sites prior to its opening, it was pushed out by local parental groups, flying pickets, unions and so on, often people who were completely against academies and free schools in the first place, people who weren't even living in the local area, but who wanted to deny children the chance of an innovation in their education. And that was very sad to see. Now, there's a very young Tony Blair. I don't know if Tony Blair is a particularly well-known face over here. I wouldn't expect him to be, but he was our Prime Minister from 1997 until 2007. And then his predecessor, Gordon Brown, until 2010 in the Labour government. He was, broadly speaking, seen as a revolutionary in British politics. British politics had endured, or perhaps suffered, many, many years of tired, empty politics at the end of a Conservative government's reign, where they basically run out of ideas, they were deeply unpopular, they were in the grip of multiple scandals, and there was no money left. But enough about 2024. But boom, that was where we were. Tony Blair came along and he represented to many people a new hope to some extent. There was an odd sense of joy in the country. Somebody new, someone relatively young and so on. A very intelligent, articulate man, understood his brief and was certainly a very good international statesman as well. But prior to 2010, the average tenure of the average education secretary was 18 months. Now, this only creates policy churn. It only creates a sense of, I want to get rid of my predecessor's successes. I want to create my own successes, because nobody wants to amplify the success of your predecessor. Personal motivation abounds. There was very low evidence basis for what it was people were doing, including things like behaviour. I had the good fortune to manage to ask Tony Blair a question once at a summit, and everyone was waving my hand to be heard, and eventually they had to pick me. And I said, what evidence bases did you use to inform your education revolution? Because his party was all about education. Education, education, education was the mantra of the party. They poured money into education. It was the glory days. It was the good times in education. We were swimming in funding. It was extraordinary. We'll never see days like that again. And yet the impact was incredibly low. Standards remained roughly where they were. Which reminds us that you can spend a lot of money, but if you don't spend it on the right things, you won't get the impact. And that sadly was the case for where we were. And Tony Blair's response to me that there wasn't any evidence suggests that perhaps he wasn't looking quite as hard as he could have done. But then I don't blame any politician for not doing so, because it's incredibly hard when you're in a political sphere to be in charge of all of your briefs, particularly when you've got multiple briefs or a very, very broad brief. What one relies on, of course, is good advice. And frequently the advice was not good. There was a wonderful paper published in 2010, which I wrote a paper on called Instinct or Reason, How Education Policy is Made. And we found that when you asked all of the post-war education ministers, what was it that caused you to create the education policy that you did? What influenced you? What was behind you? What inspired it? There was a series of multiple interviews, and these answers were collated and categorized. And the number one thing that influenced most education ministers' own educational policy was their own experience of school. Now, that's not irrelevant. It's completely relevant. Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? It's their personal experience. And of course, these things matter a lot. David Blunkett, for example, was one of our education ministers, and he was blind. And his experience of being, what in his view, kind of partitioned into a blind school as a young child and made to feel special and odd was one of the reasons why he embraced so readily and heavily the policy of inclusion, that we should, wherever possible, include children in the same educational spaces. And certainly for something like, my goodness, blindness and so on, one can understand that. What a terrible thing to do, say you have to go to a blind school. Well, why can't we have schools where blind children are welcome and accommodated? But there was other things. The experience of their friends or family, which I think certainly broadens the evidence base a little bit. But we're not quite at the RCT level yet, nor necessarily do we always have to be, and that's not always necessarily the gold standard in this. Other evidence bases are available, but we're not quite there yet. Ideology was a huge one. What should people be like? What do I consider acceptable amongst my party? Party manifesto promises, of course, featured strongly. Money, budgets, treasury concerns featured very strongly. What could we afford was something which was very important. And then, of course, international comparisons, because it's often hard to know what works in education. And perhaps a cheap and simple way of at least trying to attempt to answer that question is by looking to other countries and saying, well, what do you do? Peering over the shoulder, looking over someone else's homework. This obviously can cause disastrous processes. We get what I call the Finland syndrome. Perhaps you've heard of Finland. It's nothing, we've heard of nothing but for about 10 years. The Finnish miracle, it was called. And Pasi Sahlberg was its prophet. We still see and hear from him quite a lot. Now, far be it from me to suggest, but I will, that most of what Finland's success was based on was what was happening in Finland for the previous 15 years in terms of its education policy. And very recently, before the amazing PISA results, which everybody applauded and lauded, very recently, very near to that date, they had changed their policies to embrace things like thematic learning, project-based learning, discovery learning, open classrooms, and so on. The classic Finnish model that we see, the beanbags, the high fives, the first names, the hugs, all that stuff. It wasn't quite as successful as people thought. We now see Finland going down massively in the international league tables. So beware of false prophets to some extent. This brings us to policy. Now, these are two people which you've probably not heard of, or perhaps some of the wise amongst you have. Michael Gove was Secretary of State for Education 2010 to 2014, only 4 years, but already that's at least 3 times the average tenure. Now, Michael Gove, who later became one of the architects of the massively popular Brexit policy, which we had to suffer in the United Kingdom, was all over, at the very least, his educational brief. He'd been the opposition Secretary for Education for something like 3 years. So he really understood what was going on. He hadn't just been dropped into place. And also he'd read and been inspired by many of the books and bloggers and writers in general, and teachers and leaders, which is unusual, in the educational ecosystem. And Nick Gibb was the schools minister, so he was junior to the Secretary of State. Now, he was in some ways even more important because he was continuously the schools minister with a slight period off, continuously the schools minister for almost 13 years. He just resigned quite recently. And what that meant was for 10 to 13 years, we had enormous levels of continuity. We had a golden thread going through policy, which included behaviour. And they had a strong grasp of this. And I remember I met Michael Gove many years ago, and when I was a full-time teacher, and he said, what do we need to do to improve behaviour? And I said, nothing. I said somewhat boldly and stupidly, I might add. And the reason why it was a stupid thing to say was because I was right. We didn't need any more legal levers from the government. You know, laws didn't need to be passed. It was schools and teachers that could do things differently. And I naively thought, well, we can disseminate that ourselves, until I realised the enormous potential. I can't believe I said that. I'm such an idiot. The enormous potential that policymakers can have in terms of platforming and foregrounding good ideas and sharing and disseminating, creating structures where these things were more likely. So that was a good thing. Now, Gove's legacy was this: move fast and break things. And he actually said that he knew he didn't have long in education. As it turns out, he had much longer than he thought. So his idea was very much, let's do things really quickly. And my goodness, they did. He was the kind of the Margaret Thatcher of education. And he was not universally beloved for his efforts, may I just say. You know, that's probably understating it to some extent. Although in person, he's a very, very charming person. And teachers that met him or saw him in conference frequently said, what a nice man. It was the strangest thing. And yet, you know, on paper and from afar, he was very much in contention with the unions and the other institutions that inhabited education. He fast-tracked everything: curricular reform, phonics reform, perhaps you've got some of that yourself, pedagogical reform, university reform, ITE reform, teaching training providers reform, early career framework reforms. There was a lot that was done, and behaviour. And so we come, dear viewers, to me. There was a review similar to your TEEP review, Carter review, which said that there were serious weaknesses in teacher training, particularly behaviour management. It was then passed on to me to do a teacher training review of behaviour management and what we could offer instead. And one of the things I found was that most teacher training institutions were not teaching behaviour management. Fancy that. So it wasn't just me, it was almost everybody. So what I wrote was a couple of papers. The first one was called Creating a Culture, where I investigated 200 high-performance, well-behaved schools in very challenging demographics. So these were genuinely high successful schools, not merely schools that enjoyed fortunate demographics and highly socialised children with lots of cultural capital. These were children from the most challenging areas. I looked at 200 schools and encapsulated the life lessons from the people who led it and the teachers who worked within them. And I wrote Creating a Culture. I'm sure you read little else. I'm sure it's rarely off your desk. It is available to download and it's free. It even has pictures, which is very unusual for the Department of Education. I rewrote the mental health guidance for schools, which is to say we wrote guidance for schools in order to help them optimise the mental health of teachers, staff and students. We created what I call the Behaviour Hubs programme, which is a peer-to-peer network funded by £10 million, where we create a network of over 800 schools in the UK who support one another at leadership level when it comes to behaviour. This has had lots of very, very good impact, lots of success. We rewrote the early career framework for new teachers to include masses of teacher training in behaviour management. They were entitled to it. It was a legal obligation that they received it. We reviewed initial teacher education. So what they were being taught in their first year had to include a behavioural component. There was no shirking it or backing out this time. We revised the head teacher qualifications, the MPQHs, to include a behavioural component. I've written behaviour programme twice. I must have been very proud of that one. Last year, I rewrote the behaviour guidance for schools, which is now the required behavioural processes that schools have to follow. Some of it is mandatory and legally required, and some of it is advisory. But at least it gives head teachers a scaffold of how to run their schools behaviourally. It also offers a scaffold for how teachers should approach behaviour in the classroom. The feedback's been good. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think it's been very effective and very successful. And also, I helped Ofsted to rewrite their guidance on how they observe schools and what they look for in a well-behaved school, if that makes sense. So they're no longer just looking for schools where, you know, there isn't a fight or something like that. They're looking to see, are children following habits and patterns prescribed by the school, administered and upheld with love and boundaries ruled by compassion. That's had a big impact on the way the schools are now evaluated in behaviour. So no longer are schools punished for example, occasionally excluding or suspending a child if it was necessary. And sometimes it is necessary. And we mustn't artificially reduce those numbers. We need to reduce those numbers by making exclusions and suspensions less necessary, rather than simply turning off the tap. So the focus in schools has started to become, and of course we're talking a national picture here, there are 20,000 schools in England. You cannot move a ship that large and also that disparate and disconnected very quickly, but we have started to see a renewed focus on learned behaviours, practiced routines, boundaries and consequences. Low tolerance, not zero tolerance. Zero tolerance is a marketing phrase. I have no time for zero tolerance. Every rule has an exception. Even in Glasgow, where I come from, murder is frowned upon. But you are still permitted, if I may say so, mitigations of circumstance, for example, as self-defence or in response to intolerable cruelty, or that might be a mitigating circumstance, or acts of war and so on. Every rule has to have an exception, or it's a cruel rule. Zero tolerance, the idea that we automatically respond to behaviour the same way no matter what, has no place in classrooms. But very low tolerance, well, that's something else perhaps entirely. Sweating the small stuff, noticing when children are late, noticing when they don't have a pen, not necessarily sanctioning them for it, but noticing and caring and doing something about it, rather than simply saying, oh, what can you expect from kids like this? That's what sweating the small stuff means to me and what I try to promote. And a prioritisation of in-house training over professional qualifications, a sense of you're good at your job if you can show you're good at your job in the job, rather than simply being good at the job because you have a certificate to show you are. And when it comes to behavioural expertise, nothing can be more important than knowing how to run a classroom well. Beware, not just of the Jabberwock, but beware of taking advice from people who couldn't run a classroom themselves when they tell you how to run a classroom. I find it strange I even need to say that. But we do, apart in education, which is often dominated, as I say, by domain elites rather than domain experts. Did it work? Pretty sure it has. He says somewhat bullishly. Killer Community School, highest performing school in the UK, rated and also rated outstanding, which is by the by. But whichever way you cut it, it's rated outstanding for its provision for children with special needs. It's rated outstanding for children's progress. It's rated outstanding for absolute grades and qualifications. It is an outstanding school. It's not the only one, but it's a fantastic example. I'm actually more interested in replicating its scale. So let's look at some of the academy chains, Harris Academies, which has got scores and scores of schools focused in the least wealthy, lowest socio-economic demographics of the United Kingdom. It's enormously successful. I think almost every one of its schools is good or outstanding by inspectorate qualification. That doesn't happen by accident, and it happens because they follow most of these principles, particularly behaviourally, because one of my strong contentions is that behaviour underpins everything we're trying to achieve, including academic progress, creativity, critical thinking, democratic participation, any success criteria you wish to have for a school, behaviour underpins it, including, crucially, safety. Star academies, Dixon's Trinity Academies. Oh, I mean, there are ARC Academies. There's multiple examples of schools which have learned not quite the secret, perhaps some of the nuts and bolts, the basics of running a good school, which behaviourally sustains the well-being of its children. Professor Dylan William from University College London, frequently says that schools could massively achieve enormous levels of growth, and I agree with them, if they focus on getting 3 or 4 basic things right. And it's things like recruitment and training and retention and so on. OECD PISA 2023, England is now 4th in the world for example, reading, which is probably tantamount to the phonics reforms, but of course children can't learn unless they're behaving in classes. We're doing much better than we were. This isn't to crow by any means, my goodness, like I say, we do so much wrong. But I think sometimes, maybe I'm too British about this, sometimes when we do something right, sometimes we have to say, well, look, actually, there has been an evidence of impact here, not just nationally, but also internationally as well. I'm very proud of what we've done, but there's much more to do. And there's so much we could still improve and so much we're getting wrong that I don't want to say, oh gosh, be like England, because I know how well that goes down. As a Scot, say that in Ireland, say that in Australia, I'm sure, and see how well it goes down. I'm just saying, in this particular instance, it's probably worth examining and interrogating our own experiences as I frequently do for other countries too. And I've been observing wonderful people in Australia, and the teachers and leaders in Australia are as good as anyone in the world. I think systematically there could be some improvements, but my goodness, the talent is there, and some places are doing extraordinarily well. Now, there are criticisms of these behavioural attitudes. There are criticisms of these approaches. For example, and I'll use Michaela as the touchstone here. People frequently say, oh, well, these really strict, high discipline schools, they are incredibly exclusive, that they lead to high levels of exclusion. Well, Michaela Community School is a good example. It's got a very low level of exclusion and suspension, below the national average. And the reason why is because the children's behaviour isn't allowed to get to the point where exclusion is quite so necessary. They feel safe, they feel secure. In environments in which children feel safe and secure, children from chaotic backgrounds misbehave less, because they feel safe and secure, because they realise this place is an ark. It's a place where they can be nourished and nurtured. The idea that England, for example, has got very high levels of exclusion, well, if you look at the graph there, obviously there's a bit of a bump there. But broadly speaking, there's a very slow trickle down. We had an enormous jump down because, of course, of lockdown, and it's gone down to just about pre-lockdown levels. So we don't have a very high exclusion rate in the UK, 0.08%. Less than a child in 1,000 is permanently excluded. I wish no child was ever excluded, but sometimes they have to be. The most common reason for exclusion in England is assault on a teacher or a student. That's not a small thing. These are things that could get you arrested. But in schools, we frequently say, we'll deal with it. We'll deal with it. I once had the mispleasure to work in a school where a fellow teacher was sexually assaulted by a student, big year 10 boy, who treated her extraordinarily roughly and terrified her. And the head teacher said, we'll deal with it. Don't call the police. Call the police. I very rarely say, get the police involved, because you understand when these two spheres, it can be very fractious. But sometimes, my God, call the police. And when your personal safety and liberty has been so exposed to the indignity of assault. People accuse these schools of being exam factories. I sometimes feel like we're looking for excuses now. You're doing really well, so you must be an exam factory. I don't know how that's even assessed. I don't know what level of output would satisfy somebody that school wasn't an exam factory. There's claims that these schools create mental health crises. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. There is an explosion, perhaps, in mental health circumstances across the globe. I mean, one might suggest perhaps things like lockdown. I don't know, perhaps mobile phones, smartphones. Who knows? Who knows what it is? One of the things we can ascertain fairly robustly is that it's not because some schools are a bit strict. One of the things I found when I rewrote the mental health guidance for schools was this: schools are famously very bad at treating and diagnosing mental health problems. It's almost as if we're not skilled practitioners. Fancy that. Because we're not. Most of us. Some people are, some people aren't. That doesn't mean we don't look out for red flags and warning signs, but I'll tell you what schools can do very, very well. Schools can provide an environment which is safe, calm, and dignified. That environment is the best environment for mental health. It doesn't solve mental health problems. It reduces the risk factors that lead to negative mental health. It exacerbates the positive factors that lead to better mental health. Calm, safe, dignified environments. And this is backed up by clinicians that I work with. Those are the types of places where people's mental health flourishes. It creates robots. Well, again, by this point, we're looking at people who are clutching at straws. I've never seen a school with robots in it. Even in the very strictest of schools that I go to, the children there say, we really like it here. We feel safe. We feel looked after. We feel like we matter. One of the best definitions of mattering, I said to a boy, I looked after a child in a very poor school in Glasgow. I said, do you like it in this school? He said, I love it here. I said, why do you love it? He said, because I matter. I said, why do you think you matter? What do you mean, do they care about you? And he said, because if I wasn't here, they would miss me. Right? And I love that. It's such a child's thing to say, and yet kind of childishly wise. These are the types of environments I see in schools. Schools are joyous places for children, or they can be, but when we get it wrong, they get punched in the face. They get abused and harassed and intimidated. Their lives are made in misery. And school can be a dreadful, harrowing place for many children. Their educational prospects can be ruined, their futures can be decimated when we don't get it right, when we don't look after our primary concern, which is to maintain the safety, the dignity, and the calm predictability of the environment in which the children can thrive and flourish. It is number one priority. Behaviour before all else. Not because I want to see people marching up and down stairs. We want children to behave because we love them. And that brings us to the golden age. Is it a golden age? I don't know. There have been hundreds of golden ages in hundreds of cultures and societies, probably first identified with the Greek society. People talked about the golden age where men were not perhaps literally made of gold, but they lived for long periods of time and they died peacefully in their sleep. This was a pre-agrarian age identified by the Greeks. Then there's other golden ages, La Belle Epoque of the Parisian Grand Period and so on. The Camelots of our time. I mean, who knows? Is this a golden age? I don't know. I certainly think we're enduring and enjoying some level of success in education. And one of the things we know about golden ages is that they are infrequent and they end, usually in conflict. So the Enlightenment was famously kind of bookmarked by the French Revolution, which was broadly regarded by most people as not being very successful, as not being a great moment for most people, especially if you were from the aristocracy. Golden ages tend to be ended often from within. We can look at Rome, often by complacency or being overwhelmed, perhaps by barbarians at the gates is perhaps an absurd notion, but the idea of persistent resistance from within and from without and war and so on, and people taking things for granted. To be honest, I think complacency is a burden that many of us face. David will wrestle me off the stage if I don't finish, and rightly so, because I have taken up far too much of your time, and I hope I haven't been too tedious in my efforts to do so. On the 16th of May, if you fancy coming to Melbourne, you can find out the gripping end to this 3-part drama and what we could do in the future. So it's not really the end, it's more of a kind of an endless end. But for just now, we'll take some questions, but I'd like to say to the people of you that have joined us physically, in particular, you get 2 gold stars, and for everyone at home, you get 1 gold star. Thank you very much for joining and for listening. What a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got about half an hour for questions. We've got this thing called the catch box, which means I think when you speak into it, people online can also hear you, which was a problem we had last week where people in the audience were asking questions and people at home couldn't hear. So if you put your hand up, I can either bring it to you or I can throw it to you and you'll get a chance to speak into it. So, yep.
I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. A real question around some of the work that's been happening in the UK around parent engagement. So we saw a lot about schools working with kids on the ground. You spoke a little bit about that, but I'm really keen to hear about how, through your examples, what schools did or school systems did to engage parents as part of that equation as well.
Absolutely. That's a terrific, thank you for asking. That's a really, really important question. We found that the most behaviourally astute schools very frequently, very proactively reach out to parents. Now, I'll give you an example. When you have a parents' evening, would you call it a parents' evening? Is that something? Parents' meeting? You might get 80% as a good turnout. And you get really happy with it. You think, oh, that's well done. It's the last 20% you really wanted. They're the ones that need to come in, right? So what we found with most schools they did was this. They would often be very flexible. Well, first of all, they would create the assumption that they had to come in. This wasn't a, please come in if you can. You might, really come in. So there'd be kind of they would set the expectation, you should come in. The second thing they would do is they would proactively create a relationship with the parent, particularly at the beginning of the school session, just before the child was inducted. And they would make sure that nobody would miss out. So that if they didn't come to the parents' evenings, they would have a coffee afternoon or coffee morning. And in some cases, you go knock the door, say, hi, it's nice to meet you. We understand your child's coming to our school. We need to talk to you. And they would lay bare what it was the school did. So the school wasn't a black box that the child went into and the child came out of and nobody knew what they did when they were inside. What they did was they said, welcome to our school. They value mapped with them. They said things like, we also care about your child. We care about the same thing. Because parents care about their child. So you say, so do we. And then you would say something along the lines of, right, so here's how we do things. Here's how we keep your kids safe. Here's how we make sure they flourish and learn. And so these are our behaviour policies. These are our expectations. But you start off with the values of safety and dignity and success, because most parents want that for their kid. And that's a really good way of bridging a gap with parents. So when you do have to contact them, because little Ryan set fire to the curtains, you're not just that mean, cold-hearted, blank-faced institution. It's that nice Mr. Bennett calling who spoke to us and said that Ryan can do really well here. So there was lots and lots of that, and they particularly focused on the hardest to reach parents But you're absolutely right. Without that, you'll always be fighting the same battles. Because while most parents love their children far more than we ever could because it's their child, some of those parents express that love in a very toxic way. But I could talk about that all day, but it's a great question. Thank you. No more questions. That's great. Thank you very much. It's been a really good evening. Thank you. Been a long day.
See if I can make this work.
Oh, we're doing it. We're doing it. If you're at home, just let you know that the box is now being thrown around. Rakishly.
Terrible picture.
Well done, David.
Or was it the throw? Thank you, Tom. We are currently in our school rolling out, getting granular on this behaviour, getting right down to it. But I'm wondering, and yeah, it's a big project. There can be, we're noticing, pushback, as you've mentioned. I don't want to get too specific because what if people are listening at home?
Yeah. They're all great.
No, but when there's pushback from staff who have been doing what they've been doing for a long time, what are some of the, like you mentioned about parents, how do we bring them on board? Or some top tips?
Sack them. So next question, please. Thank you. No, don't add that. Generally, that was a joke. Please, before Twitter catches fire or something. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So first of all, a lot of the things we do, I'm kind of jumping ahead to the third session here, so I feel like, you know, you're stealing, you're robbing my thunder, but I don't mind because it's a good question. So you do with parents what you do with children. It's our staff, what you do with parents and children. So you say to them, listen, what is it that you want? I'll tell you, I think I know what you want. You want your classrooms to be safe, don't you? You want to work smarter, not harder. You'd rather spend less work chasing up admin and typing things into computers. You don't want to do reprimands and calling parents. You don't have to do suspensions and detentions and homerooms and stuff like that. You want to be able to teach. You want to feel proud of yourself, don't you? You want your children to flourish and be successful. We do too. Here's how we're going to do it. And you value map. You start with the value, you move on to the behaviour. And that's when people are far more receptive to coming along with you in the journey. If you just say to them, we're doing it like this from now on, you'll get a lot more pushback. But if you say, here's what we're doing and why, or here's why we're doing it, and here's what, and here's how you can help us to do it. It's called the Benjamin Franklin effect. If you ask somebody to help you, people are much more willing to join in, especially if you can paint a kind of a broad visionary picture, which then provides specifics. And also if you say, thanks, you're doing a good job so far, we can do it better. You know, I'm really proud of what you've done so far, but let's reboot some stuff. There's the interpersonal skills you would use, for example, on a fractious parent or a troubled child, you use on your staff as well, because that's how you get ahead with people. And the last thing I'd probably suggest is that broadly speaking, you'll have Cassandras. Doomsayer. Well, to be fair, Cassandra, was right in the long run, but you'll have your doomsayer. I know it's not a perfect analogy. You'll have your doomsayers. I've seen this before, it'll never work. Good. Engage with them. Get them one by one and say to them, right, why won't this work? Yeah, I understand your good concerns, and you might have some good concerns here. And then you say to them something that they often hate. You say, how do I make this work? What do you think I could do to overcome the obstacle you just mentioned? And you make them become part of this. They might still not agree with you, and you might not agree with them, but at least they've been listened to. The second group, don't worry, the second group is the people you have to persuade a little bit, but they might come along for the journey. And your last group will be your Pollyannas. The ones that go, oh boy, I can't wait. Give them jobs. Give them jobs. Anyway, that's a broad and blunt way to say it. Good luck.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for your time. Just something that intrigued me is where you took it from the macro perspective of discussing the policy and the impact. Something I'm just curious to get your thoughts on in the interesting sort of climate that we're in at the moment, considering the influence of government and system over importance of context and the local. What are your thoughts around the sort of opportunities moving forward, or the potential changes for reforming and removing some of the state impact, where you noted that there's this 18-month churn and burn of policy? What are your thoughts around potentially the movement towards something that's more recognising the bespoke? For instance, as an element of Australian schools is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, and how policy doesn't take into account cultural and cultural practices for managing things such as behaviour.
Yeah, God, to be honest, that's an incredibly broad question. There's so many good ways to go with that. Thank you for the quality of that. What I would say is that One of the best things a government, and again, this is very much anecdata. This is my opinion here very much. I think governments are really good at setting up structures and infrastructure where people can innovate. I do not mean entirely a market model. I'm just saying the ability to innovate, which is why I'm a big supporter of the academy model and the free schools model. I think it's great when they can do that. Well, obviously with limitations and restrictions. It's not just free money. You can't just do as you please. There have been some disastrous experiments. I think people should be able to innovate at the local level. And when success is demonstrated, it should be replicated. And so that's the next point in which I think structures and state structures and federal structures should intersect. Should intersect the ability to innovate with some general guidelines, but nothing too specific. And then they should step in and they should enable the imitation and replication of cultures which could be sustainable. So that could look very different. And I'd just like to echo my earlier point. Successful schools can look very, very different depending on culture, context, circumstance, budgets, area, geography, history. There's no one perfect school. McKill is brilliant, but it's brilliant at being itself. You know, I wouldn't necessarily want to open up McKill in the Orkney Islands, you know, or Tierra del Fuego. You know, it may be that it's specific to its climate and environment. And I think we need to respect that.
Tom, thank you. My name's Daniel. I work here at Notre Dame and I go into schools supporting and observing our the mentoring of our students by classroom teachers when they're for their first teaching.
Sure.
You talked about atomisation, and I'm very interested in the early teacher program you have in the UK. Is that what they call it at the moment?
Early career framework.
Early career framework.
ECF, yeah.
It used to be new.
Yeah, NQT.
New quality.
Newly qualified teacher or not quite a teacher, depending on how you cover it.
The thing is, I really love that. I know apparently it's quite expensive in terms of funding. I don't know. I'd love you to talk about it and explain it, because it seems to be a much more integrated and less intrusive way of assessing teacher performance. We have here what's called a graduate teacher performance assessment. When I've observed classes where that's going on, it focuses the teacher and the student. It's basically test, intervene, test. I mean, that's a very broad summary.
Yeah.
So I noticed the quality of the objectives goes lower order. Instead of long-term higher order. But I also noticed that when I'm in a classroom, you get, I think you called it animatronics, you get very sort of robotic. Yes, we like Miss so, and she's being observed, so we'll behave. Do you want to talk about the new, that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, that's a broad one, so I'll tackle it as best I can. Thank you again. You know, sorry, the quality of questions is excellent, much better than last week. I must say, no, I'm kidding. You're the best class ever. Yeah, so what we do in the UK, so we have initial teacher education, ITE. Now that might be a 3-year graduate entry, or it might be a 1-year postgraduate entry bridging course called the PGCE. There's lots of ways in. There are even some what you might call quasi-apprenticeship routes, but they're less common. And once you've done that, then you're entitled to begin teaching in a school, but you're then part of the early career framework, which is I think it's a 2 or 3-year program. I'll need to check that, where there's an entitlement over those years, even when you've started your first school. And the emphasis is on good pedagogy. And I mean your good pedagogy. I don't mean what you're doing with the kids. We very frequently forget pedagogy when it comes to the way we teach teachers, which I think is very ironic. I remember sitting in a lecture theatre being told that discovery learning was the best way to learn. To which somebody said, why are we being lectured at then? Why are we finding this out for ourselves? You know, and then the lights went out and everyone said, you know, let's go. We very frequently say to new teachers, in the deep end. In the deep end is literally the worst model of pedagogy you can possibly think of. What do people do when you throw them in the deep end? They drown. So we've got this we used to have this extraordinary paradigm where teachers were often given like the hardest classes. That'll teach you. You know, you work out your behavioural skills that way. That's how people drown. So instead what we have is this expectation of course a reduced timetable. And there will be mid-term monitoring by the institution, but that will eventually segue into monitoring by the host school, who by law have to deliver a certain type and quality of course. It becomes more light touch as they go through, but there's a certification process at the end of it. in theory, at the end of the 2 years, you can still not qualify. I don't know what the attrition rate is, and I certainly don't know what the qualification rate is. Perhaps we're not deep enough into it, actually. But that's the process by which we do it. So it's still very much in-house, but with much more structure provided. It is much more mandated. And the reason why that happened is because it was felt that actually the current system was far too loose. It was the Wild West. It was very laissez-faire. So that's the kind of the rough structure put in front of it then.
Thanks, Jim.
Have the box. Nobody's catching the box, which is disappointing. Disappointing. No, that's all right. It's okay.
Thanks, Tom. So my question is, how detailed and specific should a school's behaviour policy be? What does a good one look like? And sort of furthering on that, how much of an individual teacher's own classroom practice draw on that, and how much is ideally left to their discretion? Like, what's the balance between
To be honest, that's the kind of question I was wrestling with when I was writing my behaviour curriculum. And it's basically this: the behaviour curriculum should stipulate the kind of minimum expected standards of behaviour in a school, but not just the minimum standards. It should stipulate the things that people have to do. Now, that is no more oppressive than dictating how an airline pilot should fly their plane. It's giving them the quality of experience and the skills and the knowledge base by which to do their job competently. It doesn't preclude doing other things as well. So, for example, a school behaviour policy might stipulate that everyone has to walk on the left. Right. There's a nice simple example. And the reason for that, of course, is because we want to avoid bottlenecks and crushes and so on. Or it might be walking on the right, or it might be single file corridors, or it might not. The point is plurality. What does the school think is necessary in order for the school to be safe, calm, and dignified? So the school should be able to have enormous levels of creative ability or latitude to create its own behaviour policy. So schools can be very, very different. How much that should then be from the teacher's own input? To be honest, I think that when there's a red line in the school behaviour policy, like, for example, we confiscate mobile phones, no drinking in the class, whatever, it doesn't matter to me, but whatever it is, that should be mandated. Teachers should be held accountable for that, and that should be part of their accountability process. And in my experience, most teachers are absolutely relieved to know these things. It doesn't mean they can't do other things. They can have their own behavioural routines and processes and expectations, as long as they don't counteract or go against the whole school behavioural processes. So, I mean, I'd love to, I could do a day in this, but briefly speaking, behaviour policies can look very, very different. Some micromanage, some macromanage. And the teacher's input, especially new teachers, should be fairly low, in my opinion, until they've learned their craft. And then they can start to play jazz with the arpeggios and the scales that they have learned, if that makes sense.
Question from online.
Whoa, careful.
On behalf of our online
Oh,
audience.
thank you.
We actually have 3 questions relating to positive behaviour and affirmation. But before I get to that one, I've got a nice one here from a pre-service teacher. Who's on their practical experience and been tasked with teaching a low-level academic Year 10 class. The deep issues within those students is a lack of engagement, which stems from a lack of self-belief and self-worth. Due to this, there's a high amount of poor behaviour, usually low level, but there have been times students have become volatile. What strategies do you recommend to lift the spirits and beliefs of those children that they have with themselves?
That's a long one. Thank you. I really had to listen closely to that. Thank you for that question, and I appreciate you channeling the spirits from the afterlife there. That was great with the box. Gosh, I mean, broadly speaking, what I would say is, in terms of engagement is an interesting thing because it's quite mercurial, it's quite ambiguous, it's quite abstract. And what is engagement? Engagement is when somebody focuses on something. Now, ideally, you want someone to engage in. I don't know why I'm speaking to you. If you're the person that asked it, sorry, I can talk to the room. Yeah. Engagement, broadly speaking, is when somebody focuses on something with intent, right? That's what engagement is. It doesn't mean funny or witty or charming. Oh, well, it can do, but it means when somebody's focused on something, you're engaged with it. Now, that can be done extrinsically or intrinsically, which is to say you want people to do it because they want to do it. And that leads people to many things like, making it interesting, making it fun, making it engaging. And I want students to work on stuff which isn't always fun. I want students to work on stuff that's hard. I want them to work on stuff that isn't always immediately relevant to them. If someone said, work has to be relevant to students, they'd never study Shakespeare or Dostoevsky or whatever. You want to bring the universe into a child's life. So intrinsic motivation helps. but so does extrinsic motivation. I mean, sometimes you have to say, look, we've got to do this, and I need you to finish question 10, and you need to read this, and you need to tell me what you think of this passage. Even if you don't like it, you've got to do it. Education is 90% persuasion, 10% compulsion, right? But you want to persuade as well. And the thing I usually start off with kids is I say things like, I want you to succeed, I want you to flourish, I want you to learn, and you can. And I tell you something that's addictive to children who come from low success environments. Being good at something in class, no matter how small, even if they've suddenly learned to do number bonds up to 5 or blend 2 phonemes or something like that, if you can show them, wow, you did it, good for you. That child can feel the addiction of that, and it is compelling. And I've seen this many, many times with children that you would normally write off. They want to be good at stuff. They look for esteem and status and meaning and belonging and identity. And if we can't give it to them at school, they'll find it somewhere else. They'll find it in mucking around and being rude to one another, or in gangs and set fire to the curtains, or any numbers of things that we might not wish for them. People need to feel like they matter. We can make them feel like they matter. We can say to them, you matter to me. Your success matters. Your behaviour matters to me. I care about you. I'm going to look after you. This class is going to be calm and safe and dignified because you matter to me. And in order to achieve all that, here's how we're going to behave. So you look intrinsically and extrinsically. That'll have to do for just now, but there's much more to it than that, obviously. Thank you very much for the question.
One more from our online audience. Thank you, Tom, for your presentation so far. I'm curious to know your views with regard to reward systems in schools. We've engaged with positive behaviour for learning, and we're teaching behaviour, but we're now looking at affirmations for students. Your thoughts?
Oh, rewards. I mean, how long have you got? There's loads of rewards. You can give them lollipops. You give them prizes and treats. I don't mind that. It's not a huge system, because I think sometimes children like it. I think that's very much an ad hoc, non-systematic approach to behaviour, but that's fine. If individual teachers want to say, today we're going to have a kindness reward or something like that, you know, today we're going to have an effort reward, fine, absolutely fine. People like short incentives. People don't like long incentives. If you say to kids, you know, the top prize for the best behaved student this year will be a bicycle or something like that, or a hover pad. I don't know what they like these days. An Xbox. Then most kids have given up by that point. By the time you finish the sentence, they say, well, I'm not getting that. I'm not going to win that. So it's no motivation. I'm not saying don't have that either, because sometimes most capable children deserve a reward. And, you know, you might say they're entitled to it. They deserve it rather than it's a behaviour modifier. I've seen some schools that, for example, reward children with immaculate behaviour records, and they get to use the fast track lunch queue, like a budget airline, you know. It's quite nice, actually. I've seen some schools where they say, if you've got a clean behaviour record for a month, you get to use the VIP common room. It's just a room, but it's the VIP common room. That's one thing I learned from clubs. If you want children to crawl over broken glass to get in somewhere, put a red rope in front of it. Call it the VIP room, right? Call it the Viper room or something. But the best reward is praise. But not any old praise. You can devalue praise. If you flood the market with a commodity, you devalue the commodity. So you've got to target the praise. Don't gush over everything and everyone, otherwise nobody cares what you think. You know, if you overpraise people, they think your opinion is meaningless. Whereas if you can give praise proportionately and delicately, sensitively, and target it like a scalpel, you can change kids' lives. What you do is you save the big guns for the big moments, and you pepper your language with low-level praise, because it does two things. One, it draws attention to what is required and expected and normal. So it draws a picture, it puts a spotlight on something. Two, it reinforces the child's behaviour by encouraging them to do so by the praise motivator. But you must target it specifically to the child. It's got to be in language they understand at a level which is applicable to them. There you go. That's my potted version of praise. Sure. There we go. I feel much better than I've done that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. A question about, I would suggest that a lot of schools who begin on their behavior journey do so because achievement's gone down or learning isn't as good as it should be.
Absolutely.
Now, there's a lot of reasons why academic achievement goes down or learning isn't where it should be. Where does a school start? Do they look at learning before implementing a behavior plan, or a behavior plan in front of or before the improved learning plan? I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I've never been asked that one before. That's a great question. Fortunately, I have an answer, but you know, it's nice to be asked a new question for a change. I appreciate that. Okay, one of the things that I usually say is this, is that behaviour is primary to everything else. That if you want, I mean, you're right, there are of course other factors affecting learning, but if you want children to learn, there are behaviours associated with that, which will optimise their learning. For example, attendance, punctuality, doing their best, not being dismayed or disheartened by failure, embracing failure as a means of success, asking questions, not belittling other people for getting the questions right. There's lots of behaviours associated with that. Studying, trying hard, trying to do as many questions as you can, that kind of thing. So there are behaviours associated with it. So I would normally recommend to a school which is experiencing any kind of problems, I would say begin with behaviour, because in my opinion, that my hypothesis, which I hope is strong, is that behaviour underpins everything else. Kind of like William Glasser would say, everything is behaviour, including the way I'm standing just now, the way we're conversing is behaviour. It's not just sitting still and shutting up. Good behaviour is much more than that. Good behaviour is the ability to select the correct behaviour for the moment you're in order to be successful, which means that fundamentally it's everything we do, including staff, I might add, which means we have to think about staff behaviour too. What example do they set? But how do they set routines? How do they set norms? How do they set consequences? How do they respond to children push back? How do you de-escalate conflict? How do you issue a reprimand in a dignified way? How do you issue a reward in a dignified way? How do you, whatever, how do they behave too? I would begin with behaviour policy, behaviour curriculum, turn that into a training program, train the staff to train the kids, and then create an accountability process whereby people are line managed into correct behavioural habits until they become habits, and then they become internalised, almost unconsciously done, and easy to do because people just do them automatically, like walking on the left-hand side, for example. And that's a very potted version of it, but that's the bones of it. Thank you. Fine.
One last one. Okay.
Tom, oh yeah.
Are we doing the box or?
Oh, sorry.
David, you had one job. And you're doing extremely well.
Tom, I've listened to you speak on various podcasts and I've read your books.
I can only apologise.
No, brilliant. And I feel that I have the essence of your message for the most part. But is there any aspect of that you feel like people willfully or accidentally misinterpret? Is there anything that you wish people would stop misinterpreting, so that when I'm sharing what your message is to other people, I can keep an ear out for those things that they might be choosing to misinterpret?
What that's another question I've never been asked before. So that's what a night for first that is. Every day is a skill day. Thank you very much. So you're asking me, what do I wish people who hated me stopped saying? Well, that's a beauty of a question. I know what you mean though. Okay. Feel like Jesus in the temple to some extent. Genuinely, I don't mean that literally. I feel like the one thing, if I have a purpose, is this: is to try to improve the situation. It's to try to make things better for teachers and for children. As I said, when we get it wrong, they get punched in the face. This is not a small thing. It matters a lot to me. And when you want to change things, a lot of people don't like that change. A lot of people have invested their entire careers on paradigms of behaviour management, which in my opinion have made things worse for children. That is very hard for them to accept. And they have internalised that. And psychologically, I think they embrace that. And through a process of cognitive dissonance, I think what they think is, well, you must be evil then. You must be bad because you're making me feel bad. Perhaps I'm over psychologizing this. But anyway, that's what I think happens a lot. I also find that a lot of people simply misunderstand what I'm saying, because they've never read anything I've said. They've never listened to what I say. And so if I say something like, yeah, it's okay to exclude children sometimes, I generally think you need to exclude children sometimes. And that's a hill I will die on, as little as possible, obviously. But people think he's the exclusions guy, Or if I say something like, I think that there's a space for sanction. In fact, I think there's a necessity for sanction. I've seen schools fall apart because they think, oh, we don't need sanctions. Oh, you bloody well do. There's a reason why traffic wardens and parking police don't hand out restorative tickets. They hand out penalties, right? There's a reason for this. But people think, oh, you're the punishment guy. I'm not about punishment at all. I get called the zero tolerance guy like 3 days a week. I don't know how many books I have to write about behaviour for me not to be the zero tolerance guy. I hope you don't detect any peak in my voice here, because I don't care that much. I really don't. If I have to endure some slings and arrows, if I have to stand here like Saint Sebastian and get pelters, as we say in Glasgow, I get things thrown at me, then so be it. I don't care. One, I think I'm probably right, and two, I don't care what they say. And that has made all the difference, as the poet says, because I think what I say matters, and I believe in it, but I also believe I could be wrong. But I don't believe I could be wrong because anonymous people I've never met are rude to me online. That is their own problem. Amen. Bless them all.
All right, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank Tom for his presentation tonight. Thank you. No gift for you.
What's this?
You'll see.
Is that a step?
So I'm giving it to you tonight because if it doesn't fit, I've got a day to get it changed before I can give you the right size.
I'm terrified.
There you go.
What is this? Oh, you're kidding. Oh my God. It's a dingo. What is that? What do you call it?
A Kubra.
That's a beautiful, that's far too nice a hat like for me. Now, Tuesday, I was asked what my hat size was. Now I understand why. I mean, I could have guessed if I'm honest, but I've got the largest head in creation. Does that, it's
I can get one more size up.
I need one size up.
Okay.
There's that. God bless you. That's
That's
amazing. Thank you so much. That's
That's
so kind of you.
That's
Thank you.
all right.
I'm sorry you had to witness that.
That's all right.
Thank you. That's incredibly kind of you.
All right. Thanks again, Tom. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Just turn the coffee outside and biscuits, and you all have to eat everything. Thank you.
Take it easy. That was wonderful, David. I'm really tough. You know, I mean, it's nice to get a card or something.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
Well, of course, I realised you had to take it home from the plane.
I'll work it out, something. I'll work it out, you know, for such a lovely gift, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.